The story begins on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. My internet cut out, snapping me from my work with the sudden silence that only a dead connection can bring. No big deal, I thought. It happened from time to time, but barely 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the timing struck me as odd. It wasn't until I opened the door that a man in a work uniform, complete with a tool belt and a clipboard, gave a polite nod and introduced himself as a technician from my internet provider. He had an easy, practiced smile and went straight into a spiel about how he was in the area fixing some network issues. I told him that I hadn't scheduled a visit, but he brushed it off, explaining that there had been multiple reports of outages on my street, and they were checking connections individually. "We'll have you back online in no time," he assured, flashing another smile. He stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him. I directed him to where the modem was tucked into the corner of my living room, and he began rummaging through his toolkit, pulling out gadgets that clinked and buzzed. As he moved, his eyes occasionally darted around the room in a way that made me uncomfortable. I tried to convince myself it was standard procedure. He was probably just noting where the cables ran. But as the silence thickened, I became increasingly aware of his presence, standing too close, lingering too long by my personal belongings. The man began asking questions about my internet habits, seemingly innocent inquiries, but with a strange undertone. "Do you work from home?" he asked, his gaze lingering on me. I answered vaguely, wondering why he needed that information. He nodded, jotting something down on his clipboard, but instead of returning to his work, he asked another, more personal question, something about the other devices I used, and if anyone else in the house connected to them. My unease grew. I looked away, pretending to check something on my phone while trying to think of a polite way to end this encounter. When I glanced up, his expression had shifted. He was watching me, intently, the friendly mask slipping ever so slightly. "Your provider didn't tell you I'd be stopping by?" he asked suddenly, a strange edge in his voice. His eyes didn't match his smile anymore. "No, they didn't mention anything," I replied, feeling my pulse quicken. I tried to keep my tone steady, casual. He looked down, muttering something about administrative mix-ups before returning to his work, though his pace seemed slower, almost as if he were stalling. I found myself inching toward the door, thinking of an excuse to step outside. But as suddenly as he'd arrived, he finished up, packed his tools, and said it should be working soon. He left with that same bland smile, and I waited until his van disappeared down the street before letting out the breath I'd been holding. I immediately called my internet provider to double-check, but as the representative's words filled my ear, my stomach dropped. "No," she said firmly, "we didn't send anyone out today. You weren't on our service list at all." Dread clawed at my mind as I recalled the technician's questions, his unwavering gaze. I hung up, my hands trembling as I accessed the security footage on my phone. I scrolled back to the time he had left, and there it was. On the screen, he could be seen exiting my house, his figure vanishing from view just before my internet suddenly reconnected. I watched the footage in silence, a chill creeping through my veins. I'd let him in, answered his questions, watched him move around my home. And now, with nothing but a silent screen to piece it together, I was left to wonder, who was he really, and what had he been looking for? It started with a shrill, blaring noise that jarred me out of bed. The screen on my phone glowed, lighting up my dark bedroom. The alert was unmistakable, an emergency broadcast telling residents to stay indoors due to a hazardous event nearby. It was an eerie feeling. I'd heard of alerts like this, but I'd never received one before. My first instinct was to check outside, to see if I could spot anything unusual. But as I moved toward the window, my phone buzzed again. Another alert flashed across the screen. "We see you looking out the window. Step back, or we'll come inside." My heart hammered. My fingers tightened around the phone as I read the words, each one sinking in with a chill. I took a step back, instinctively looking around the room, trying to process the message. It had to be a glitch, some twisted prank, I told myself, yet I couldn't shake the fear pulsing through me. The timing, the wording, the unmistakable threat. It was all too targeted, too specific. But curiosity gnawed at me, a force stronger than the fear, so I crept back to the window. Outside, the street looked perfectly normal. The glow from street lamps washed over empty sidewalks, and every house was still. No sign of panic, no flashing lights, just the quiet stillness of an ordinary night. I was beginning to feel foolish when my phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a single line, "Last warning." I stumbled back from the window, dropping the phone in my panic, my mind racing. How was this happening? No one could be watching me, I thought. Yet, every nerve screamed that someone was out there, watching my every move. I paced the room, trying to shake off the panic as I thought of who could be behind this. Just as I was building the courage to peer outside again, a sound froze me in place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, right outside my front door. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to make no sound. I held my breath, counting the seconds, but the footsteps just grew louder, each one heavy, purposeful. Then, silence. I strained to hear, willing myself to move, to look, but terror held me in place, locking me in the dark. I don't know how long I stood there, listening, waiting, but when I finally dared to pick up my phone again, my heart plummeted. Another message had appeared, simple and chilling. "We're here." I couldn't bring myself to open the door, to check the window, even to move. My only thought was to call the police. My fingers shook as I dialed, each ring stretching into an eternity, until finally an operator answered. I gave them my address, forcing the words out in a low, controlled voice, praying they'd arrive quickly. Minutes passed like hours. I didn't move, barely breathed, afraid that any sound or motion would reveal my position. And then, at last, red and blue lights flashed outside. I stumbled to the door, flung it open, and called out to the officers. They swept the property, their presence calming the terror that had gripped me. They found nothing. No one outside, no sign of forced entry. They assured me it was safe, probably some kind of prank, they said, and advised me to keep my phone close. As they left, I felt a surge of relief, mixed with lingering unease. Later that night, lying wide awake, I received one final message. "Next time, you won't get a warning." It left me staring at the screen in the darkness, clutching the phone to my chest, my mind reeling with questions that would never have answers. I had taken up jogging late at night. I told myself it was the only time I could escape the noise of the day, the only time I could clear my head. The streets in my quiet suburb were deserted, the air crisp under the dim streetlights. But soon I began to notice him. He was always there, running the opposite direction, like clockwork. He wore a plain gray hoodie, nondescript joggers, nothing unusual really. And yet, something felt wrong about it. Each night, it was the same, a brief, silent encounter, him passing me by with a fixed gaze ahead, as if I didn't exist. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was just being paranoid. But night after night, there he was like some sort of shadow in my routine, and always wearing the same thing. One night, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling he gave me, I changed my route, taking a longer loop through a nearby park. I told myself it was silly, but deep down I was testing something. The path was quiet. The only sounds were my own footfalls and the distant rustle of leaves. I'd almost managed to forget about him when I spotted a figure in the distance. The unmistakable gray hoodie, those same silent, steady strides. My heart lurched. There was no way he could have known I'd changed my route. I sped up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I refused to turn around, determined to outpace him, to shake off the sense of dread that clung to me. But as I rounded a corner, there he was directly ahead of me, still coming closer, his face obscured by the hood. I couldn't understand how he'd managed to get in front of me. I hadn't heard him change directions. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, but my legs kept moving, propelling me toward him, like I was drawn to some invisible force. As we passed, his head turned, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. His stare was intense, empty, like looking into a void. I broke into a sprint, pushing past him, feeling his gaze burning into the back of my neck. My lungs ached, my muscles burned, but the thought of stopping felt more dangerous than exhaustion. When I reached home, I slammed the door behind me, locking it, finally letting out the breath I'd been holding. I forced myself to calm down, to dismiss it as a random encounter, something that didn't mean anything. But I couldn't ignore the way he'd looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to know something I didn't. My skin crawled, and I double-checked every lock on every window, trying to convince myself I was safe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, heart pounding, my mind replaying every detail, every look, every step. When I finally drifted off, it was only to wake up to the sound of a faint tap on my window. My chest tightened, my pulse drumming in my ears as I lay there, paralyzed, straining to hear any further sound. Summoning the courage to move, I crept out of bed and glanced at the window. Nothing. Just the still darkness of the night, the empty street beyond. But as I turned back, I froze. Just outside my window, in the faint glow of the streetlight, was a single, muddy footprint, perfectly centered on the ledge. And next to it, my own running shoes, damp and dirty, neatly placed where I'd never left them. Volunteering at the church was supposed to be a peaceful way to spend my weekends. I enjoyed the quiet, the solitude of it. They had asked me to help clean out an old confessional booth, tucked away in the far corner of the empty sanctuary. Dust motes floated in the low light, casting shadows along the worn wooden walls, and the silence hung thick in the air. The confessional was small, dark, with a scent of old wood and faint mildew. As I ran a cloth along the bench inside, my hand brushed against something rough, hidden beneath the grime. Scratched into the wood were words, faint and jagged as if carved in a hurry. They were confessions, dark, fearful lines pleading for forgiveness, for mercy. Each sentence was short, fragmented, but the fear behind them was palpable. One phrase caught my eye. "He's coming for me." Over and over again, that line repeated, scratched deeper each time. My pulse quickened, my hand frozen on the words as a cold chill crawled up my spine. The sanctuary was empty, but I suddenly felt watched, as if someone stood right behind me, unseen but suffocatingly close. A sense of dread settled over me, heavy and inescapable, urging me to leave. As I left the booth, still shaken, an elderly priest approached, his expression somber. He warned me in a low voice, almost a whisper, some things are better left unheard. His eyes were distant, shadowed with something I couldn't read, something I didn't want to understand. I nodded, feigning calm, but my hands shook as I gathered my things and left, his words echoing in my mind. That night, alone in my small apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional murmur of the wind against the windows. I tried to sleep, but each time I closed my eyes, the words I'd read came back to me, scratching their way into my mind. Then my phone rang, a jarring sound in the quiet darkness. The screen glowed with an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, telling myself it was probably a wrong number, some innocent mistake. But when I lifted the phone to my ear, there was no voice, just a long silence, the kind that fills a room, the kind that doesn't belong in the middle of the night. Then, softly, a whisper, almost too faint to hear. I strained, holding my breath, my fingers gripping the phone. It repeated one of the confessions I'd read earlier, word for word, with an urgency that made my skin crawl. I froze, my heart pounding as I realized I wasn't alone in my own home. Someone or something knew what I had read, what I had seen, and now it was here closer than I could bear. I never returned to that church. I never spoke of what I'd read or heard. But even now, in the dead of night, I sometimes wake to the faint sound of scratching, like words being carved into wood, or perhaps whispered into the stillness around me. And each time, I am reminded that some secrets are meant to stay buried, left unheard, untouched. It was my first week at a small accounting firm. The place had a quaint, almost antique charm to it. Everything from the faded wallpaper to the creaky floors hinted at its age. They assigned me a desk in the corner, a heavy wooden thing with ornate carvings and one drawer that refused to open. It didn't bother me at first. I was too busy trying to learn the ropes, settling into a new routine. But one night, I was the last one there, finishing up some paperwork. The office was eerily quiet. The only sound was the occasional groan of the old building settling. And then I heard a faint tapping. I stopped, listening closely. It was coming from the drawer. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe something loose inside. But curiosity gnawed at me, and finally, I gave in. I grabbed a screwdriver from the supply closet and wedged it into the crack, feeling the wood groan as I forced the drawer open. Dust filled the air as it slid out, revealing a small, old-fashioned cell phone tucked away beneath a stack of yellowed papers. The phone looked outdated, the screen scratched and dark. I picked it up, feeling its cold weight in my hand, and as I did, the screen flickered to life, buzzing softly. My hands went clammy as a message appeared on the screen. "You shouldn't have done that." My breath caught. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be a glitch, some weird leftover text. I held my finger over the power button, but before I could turn it off, the phone buzzed again, another message appearing. "We know where you are." Panic surged. I looked around the dim, empty office, feeling exposed. The phone kept buzzing, message after message flooding the screen in quick succession. Each one was worse than the last, a chilling litany of statements about my location, my movements, even what I was wearing. They knew everything, and with each line, the sense of dread wrapped tighter around my chest. Unable to look at the screen any longer, I shoved the drawer shut and scrambled to pack my things. I didn't bother turning off my computer, didn't check my work. I just wanted out. As I stepped into the hallway, my own phone buzzed in my pocket. Heart pounding, I pulled it out, expecting some emergency notification or maybe a call from a coworker. But it wasn't from anyone I knew. The message simply read, "You can't leave." I bolted for the exit, my footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. I fumbled with the lock, hands trembling, finally forcing the door open and stepping into the night air, filling my lungs with the cold, grounding relief of being outside. But as I walked away, my phone buzzed one last time. I hesitated, my skin prickling as I read the new message, "See you tomorrow." The next morning, I found a new lock on the drawer. When I asked about it, my boss gave a casual answer, saying he'd forgotten to mention that the drawer had always been locked for a reason, some old company policy. But his expression held something darker, something that told me it was better not to ask any further questions. I tried to go back to work, to ignore the nagging fear that something was waiting for me each time I sat down at that desk. It was a simple favor. I lent my library card to a classmate, someone who'd forgotten theirs and only needed it to check out a textbook for a project. I didn't think much of it, just handed it over and told them to return it whenever they were done. They thanked me, and I forgot about it. The next day, I received a message from the library. I expected it to be a routine notification, but when I opened it, my stomach lurched. They informed me that my card had been used to check out several graphic, unsettling books detailing violent, unsolved crimes, cases that had haunted the community years ago. I was baffled, scrolling through the list of borrowed titles, feeling my skin crawl. I confronted my classmate about it later, but they denied ever using my card. They even claimed they'd returned it to my bag during class, something I had no memory of. The conversation left me uneasy, an odd weight settling over my thoughts as I wondered who else could have used my card. Shrugging it off, I chalked it up to a mix-up at the library, a clerical error, maybe. But when I got home that evening, the unease grew into a gnawing tension. There on my desk was a neat stack of library books, the very same ones from the message, placed carefully as if someone had known precisely where I would find them. A chill raced down my spine. My door had been locked. I hadn't seen anyone come or go. I picked up one of the books, the weight of it heavy and wrong in my hand. It opened to a page marked with a sticky note, a faint scrawl across the top in handwriting I didn't recognize. "You should be more careful who you trust." I backed away, the note slipping from my fingers. My mind raced through every possibility, but each explanation felt more absurd than the last. I thought of calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That someone was using my library card to leave me strange messages? It sounded ridiculous. That night, I barely slept, my thoughts circling back to that message, that warning. When I finally drifted off, it was only to wake to a faint shuffling sound. I froze, lying perfectly still, ears straining in the darkness. Someone was inside. I could feel it, that quiet presence moving through my room, lingering over my desk. I waited, heart pounding, until the silence settled back into place. In the morning, there was no sign of an intruder, but my library card had been placed back in my bag, spotless and ordinary, as if nothing had ever happened. I returned the books to the library, slipping them onto the counter with an urgency I couldn't hide. The librarian gave me a curious look, but I didn't wait to explain. Even now, weeks later, I keep that card buried in the bottom of a drawer, never used, never touched. Every so often, though, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight, watching, waiting to see if I've learned my lesson. I got home late one evening, juggling my bags and fumbling with my keys as I approached the door. It was only when I reached the entrance that I noticed something strange. The door was already slightly ajar, the lock twisted and barely holding it closed. My pulse quickened as I hesitated, glancing around the quiet hallway, searching for any sign of movement. The building was silent. Pushing the door open cautiously, I stepped inside, half expecting to find the place ransacked. But to my surprise, everything looked just as I'd left it. The drawers were open, though, every single one, as if someone had been searching for something in each of them. But nothing seemed to be missing. An odd sense of violation crept over me as I slowly closed the door, my gaze sweeping across the room. I grabbed my phone, about to call the police. When I heard it, a faint sound from the bedroom closet, a soft, shuffling noise that sent every nerve in my body on high alert. I froze, hardly daring to breathe, my mind racing through every possible explanation. But none of them calmed the dread that had taken root inside me. For a long moment, I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to run. But instead, I edged toward the closet, heart hammering with each step. I reached out, hand trembling as I grasped the handle, and pulled it open in one swift motion. Nothing. Just clothes hanging undisturbed, shadows pooling in the corners. Relief flooded over me, but it was quickly replaced by unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here, that someone was watching, hiding just out of sight. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside left me tense and staring into the darkness, listening, waiting. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease. Something still felt wrong. When the police arrived to check things over, they were calm, professional, but offered little reassurance. They found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing out of place. Just an unlocked door and open drawers. And that could have been my own carelessness, they said. But as I was tidying up later, I noticed something that sent a new chill through me. Hidden up in the ceiling light, nestled behind a cover, was a small, black camera lens, aimed directly at my bed, still recording. My partner and I had been looking forward to our weekend getaway for weeks. A cozy Airbnb nestled in a quiet town, the perfect escape. We arrived late in the afternoon, pleased to find a small cottage just as charming as the photos had promised. But as we unlocked the door and stepped inside, we heard voices, a startled gasp, then footsteps. Another couple stood in the middle of the living room, equally shocked to see us. They explained that they'd also booked the place for the weekend. We compared our reservations, and sure enough, both were valid. It was clearly a mix-up, and neither of us could get in touch with the host. Awkwardly, we agreed to make the best of it and share the space for the night. The evening began with polite small talk, all of us tiptoeing around each other, unsure how to navigate the situation. They seemed friendly enough, but something felt off. They knew details about our lives, small things we hadn't mentioned. At first, it seemed innocent, like when they asked about my partner's job. Maybe they heard us chatting as we unpacked. But when they mentioned a nickname only our close friends used, I felt a faint prickling of unease. Trying to shake off the tension, I went to the kitchen to prepare some snacks. When I returned, the woman looked at me strangely, as if she'd been expecting me to bring something else. She gave a small, knowing smile, her eyes lingering on me too long, like she was sizing me up. It left me feeling exposed, my every move observed. By late evening, I was desperate for privacy. My partner and I retreated to our room, closing the door firmly behind us. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the strangeness of sharing a space with strangers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Lying in bed, I could hear faint murmurs from the other side of the door, their voices low and indistinct. I woke in the middle of the night, an eerie silence filling the house. For a moment, I felt relieved, thinking maybe they'd left. But as I reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, just enough to see into the hallway. There, silhouetted in the darkness, stood the man, watching us, his face barely visible but unmistakably staring. My heart pounded as I lay still, pretending to be asleep, my breathing shallow and controlled. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and slipped back into their room, the door clicking shut softly. The next morning, they were gone without a trace. No bags, no signs they'd ever been there at all. The host, when we finally reached him, insisted we were the only guests booked that weekend. And as I looked around the quiet, empty cottage, the sense of being watched lingered, like they'd never truly left. It was well past midnight when I found myself driving home on a lonely stretch of road, the kind of place where even the streetlights seemed too sparse, leaving wide sways of darkness between pools of dim light. The silence in the car felt oppressive, only broken by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the windshield wipers. Rain had started to fall in a steady, rhythmic patter against the windows, blurring the world outside into a smear of shadows and reflections. As I neared an underpass, the red light ahead stopped me, forcing me to wait alone in the eerie stillness. The empty road stretched out in either direction, completely void of life, making me acutely aware of just how isolated I was. The longer I sat there, the more the shadows around me seemed to thicken, pressing in closer, and I fought the irrational urge to run the light, to get away from that spot as quickly as possible. And then I saw him. From beneath the underpass, a figure emerged, shrouded in shadows, his features obscured by the low light. He walked toward my car with slow, deliberate steps, his face partially hidden by the hood of his jacket. He stopped just outside the range of my headlights, his silhouette standing perfectly still in the rain. I tried to look straight ahead, ignoring the stranger, willing the light to change. But my eyes kept flicking back to him, drawn by an inexplicable dread that coiled in my chest. He raised a hand and tapped softly on my window. I stayed still, my hands tightening on the wheel as I told myself it was nothing, just a random person. But then he leaned close, his face almost pressing against the glass, and his voice, low and rough, reached me through the downpour. "You have to leave." His tone wasn't threatening, but the urgency in his voice sent a shiver through me. I glanced at the light, willing it to turn green, my pulse racing. And then he tapped again, harder this time, his eyes boring into mine through the rain-splattered glass. He didn't repeat himself, just waited, his presence heavy and unyielding, his stare filled with something I couldn't place. Finally, the light changed. I hit the gas, speeding off without a second glance, watching in my rearview mirror as his figure faded into the darkness beneath the underpass. The drive home felt like a blur, my mind stuck on the encounter, replaying his words, the way he'd looked at me as if he knew something terrible that I didn't. The next morning, I turned on the news, absently sipping my coffee, still trying to shake off the memory of the man on the road. But as the broadcast continued, my stomach dropped. They were reporting a violent crime, an assault that had taken place under that same underpass, only minutes after I'd left. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, a cold realization settling over me. I didn't know who he was or how he'd known what would happen, but his warning had saved me from something I could barely comprehend. Even now, I can't drive that route without feeling his gaze in the shadows. A reminder that sometimes the strangest warnings are the ones you can't afford to ignore. Friends, Please support my channel by subscribing and liking it. You are the best.